Hello and welcome to another episode of Hair Bear's Short Stories. And if you found your way to my cozy little corner of the internet and you like a story or two, sit back and relax, have a listen, have a laugh, take your shoes off and set a spell. So I'm still getting over a bit of a cold, which seems to be happening with more frequency lately. Yay, COVID. So my apologies if my quality isn't up to its usual standards. So we're going to be reading chapter 8 today of my unfinished work, Whole, which I'm coming up to the end of it, my unfinished part, pretty quickly. I probably should do something about that. But I want to put a pretty big trigger warning on this one because this one does involve scenes of violence and kidnapping. So if you're okay with that and you're still with me, then let's take a deep breath and we'll continue on with chapter 8 of Whole. Abduction. Ben's mind raced, even as his weary legs slogged through the rotation of his Schwinn's pedals. It all made a horrible kind of sense, but he couldn't bring himself to accept it. Why, after all this time, would this be suddenly happening to him again? He hadn't had a blackout since he was a kid. It had taken long enough just to convince his parents to get him into therapy, and that was only because Steve backed him up. His parents seemed to think it was an attention-seeking phase that he would grow out of. After years of working with a therapist and practicing different coping techniques, the episodes had finally stopped. The second they did, his parents ended his sessions. While he was grateful that they had allowed him therapy at all, Ben had a nasty suspicion that they were mildly mortified to have a child seeing a therapist. It didn't jibe with the family image they wanted to present. Regardless, he had gained enough introspection at that point to avoid regressing, and he regularly employed the calming and grounding exercises he had learned, especially when he was particularly stressed. It became a period of his life largely forgotten. He hardly even had to do the exercises anymore. And then again, that may be the problem. He eased his bike a little bit further to the right to allow for the traffic he could hear behind him. Ben's bicycle had been his primary transportation long enough for this to be second nature, preoccupied as he was. Then again, he mused, he had been under more and more stress since he had come to this place so far from his home and everything he was familiar with. The brightest points of his life that he had clung to these days had been Scruff, Nana, Ronnie, and Gato, and two of them had been in serious peril that night, and he felt something that he hadn't felt since back in those difficult days, only maybe stronger. Was it possible that all his efforts hadn't expunged that part of him that caused the fits, but only suppressed it? Boxed it up somewhere out of sight, all the while every annoyance, every slight, every assault on Ben's humanity was just feeding it. Had gotten it big enough to do what Gato had said happened. He always assumed when he blacked out he had simply been unconscious, except for that one nagging memory of a dimming red haze, the taste of blood in the back of his throat, and the neighbor's son crying. The vehicles he had heard must have been further behind him than he had thought, because they hadn't passed him yet. Either that or they didn't think they had enough room to go around him. Ben slowed a bit and eased a bit further off the shoulder. Ben shook his head. He could go round and round with this line of thought all day. The only people who were with him during those times were his parents and Steve. When he had finally gotten to a stable enough headspace to inquire about what had happened during those blank spots, his parents would simply ignore the question, and Steve would change the subject. But Steve was coming to finally visit tomorrow, wasn't he? After a fashion, anyway. Making time for him during a work trip was still the most anyone in his family had done for him in Yonks. He would be in his orbit, though, and he knew about the fight. He had even offered him legal help, which, if it turned out as badly as it sounded, he might be defending himself in criminal trial rather than suing them. Maybe if he spun it as an insanity plea, Steve would be more open about the nature of his previous blackouts. He was getting ahead of himself. He had a lot to do before that point. He'd have to verify his time on the schedule first, which meant he needed to get home. Even after the promise to his brother, he left his cell phone at home in his haste to leave. Then he'd have to do what he could to make the place presentable. A futile endeavor, perhaps, but Ben did still have some pride. A vehicle's horn honked behind him. What was with this guy? There was nobody in the oncoming lane of the two-lane highway, and Ben was 4 feet to the right of the white line, all the way to the edge of the pavement. It wasn't as though there wasn't enough room to go by. Since his bike's road tires didn't handle well in the gravel roadbed, he took the only other course available to him at that point. He turned off the pavement and brought his bike to a halt. If Ben had not been so involved with his own circular internal argument and had been listening to the warning bells he had developed over years of being targeted by bullies, he would have realized what a terrible idea this was. It all came crashing back to him, though, as the vehicle behind him pulled up suddenly beside him on the shoulder. It proved to be a full-sized, windowless dark van, the sliding side door slamming open to reveal two absolute units wearing ski masks. Before Ben could disentangle himself from his bicycle, they lunged at him, gripped him by the shirt, hair, and most worryingly, his groin, and hauled him into the van. So oversaturated was he by the bizarre occurrences and sudden, unwarranted violence over the last few days, the only thing going through Ben's mind as his head rebounded off the opposite side of the van's interior from the sheer zealousness of his abduction was, could these guys be any more cliched? Then, the combination of head trauma and the van door slamming shut caused Ben to once again fall into oblivion. With a grunt of satisfaction, Alan clicked the last padlock into place. The little guy his boys had hauled off the street was chained up real nice against the support post in the back of his chop shop garage. They had wrapped him around him from his feet to his armpits and looped more around his wrists and hooked them to the rafters, splaying his arms out wide like he was doing the YMCA dance. Alan chuckled at his own joke. The two doors on either end of the garage were secured with padlocks, as well as the 3 roll-up doors for good measure. Nobody was getting in to interrupt them until Alan found out what had happened to his brother, and he had 3 of his biggest, most badass boys with him to beat the answers out of this guy. He highly doubted from the look of him that he could have been the one that had ganked Chris, especially when he had that big dude with him that he always hung out with. The other ratty little guy was in that wrecked car too, so whoever it was would have had to take them all on at once. The rat guy never seemed like much to Alan, but he had heard he was a vicious little fucker with a knife. It was a shame the car had been wrecked too. One of Alan's shops had done some work on the engine. The flashy upgrades had been legit because Alan wasn't an idiot and didn't want attention brought to his business. What he didn't tell Chris, though, was that his shops put a tracker on every car they did work on. It was useful for several reasons. Some guys he'd had working for him thought they were smart, and some of his cars had been stolen from the garage, with the doors broken to make it look like someone had busted in. He didn't tell them about all the cameras he hid in the shops, too. Sometimes, on rare occasions when it suited him, Alan would accept partial payment if the customer was vouched for, and the tracker would let him know where to send his boys to bust some kneecaps and take it back. When he figured out he could make extra by getting some of the payment and get the car back, he started doing this more often. The tracker on Chris's car had put it in a vineyard right before it headed straight for the mountains and over a cliff. The tracking history also showed that Chris never went up into the mountains. He liked to tool around the valley and smash up dive bars. The guys Alan had sent to check the place out told him there was somebody living in a shitty little hut in the middle of the vineyard, not far from where Chris's car was, that rode a bike around everywhere. If something went down there that night, that dude was either there or knew something about it, and Alan was going to get it out of him. Everything was ready, but the little guy wasn't waking up. Alan frowned. In the movies, people always woke up right when they were all tied up and everything. "Why isn't he awake yet?" he asked his guys that had brought him in. "Did you hit him too hard?" "I dunno," Brett replied, shrugging his massive gym-toned shoulders. "He bumped his head against the van when we grabbed him." "What a pussy," Alan sneered, and the boys laughed with him. Migo walked up to the guy chained to the post, pulled back and slapped him across the face. When he got no response, he did it again, then twice more. "That ain't waking him up," Alan noted. Migo's gold tooth glinted as he smiled back at him. "Lo siento, jefe. Is that what we are doing now?" "Hang on, fellas. I got an idea," Bo said as he headed off into the corner. The beefy, corn-fed redneck came back with a dusty first aid kit and started rooting through it. He fished out a little paper packet of smelling salts and held it up with a black-toothed meth-head grin. "Me and my brothers use these if we banged our heads on something. Then we'll put lead in your pencil." Alan snatched the packet from Bo and looked at it. "You gotta snap it in half and sorta wave it under his nose," Bo stated. Alan went to the chained-up guy, crushed the packet in his fist, grabbed the guy by the hair, and rammed it up his nose. He took a quick step back so he would be in full view when he came to. He wanted this guy to know how screwed he was. His prisoner's eyes immediately flew open, and he sneezed the smelling salts out of his nose. Alan was glad he had stepped back. If he had gotten snot on his shoes, he would have had to knock the guy unconscious again. The Joker had it right. You don't hit someone in the head when you want info from them. They'll get too woozy. The Joker knew his shit. He was a bit disappointed, however, once the guy was done sneezing and shook his head to clear it. Instead of the fear Alan was hoping to see on his face, he just sort of looked around and shrugged as best he could in his chains with an expression that said, "I guess this might as well be happening," then just seemed to be standing there, waiting to see what happened next. Disgruntled, Alan nodded to Migo, who flashed his gold-toothed grin and approached the prisoner. He didn't have to tell Migo not to hit him in the head again. Migo knew his shit too. Instead, Migo buried his fist in the guy's gut and stepped to the side just before he puked all over the floor. Alan went as close as he could without stepping in it and said in a menacing voice, "You puked on my floor, asshole." "My bad," the prisoner rasped, his head still down. He jerked his chin towards the chains. "If you loosen these up for me, I could get a mop and take care of that for you." Migo stomped on the dude's foot, and he shut up, gritting his teeth and groaning. "Nah, see, you're staying right where you are till I find out who got my little brother." His prisoner looked up and peered at Alan thoughtfully. I heard about you and your family. You must be Alan." "Hi, Alan. I'm Ben." That was just too much. Heedless of the puke on the floor, Alan punched Ben in the face. His head bounced off the support post and he went limp again. "God damn it!" Alan swore, wiping his foot on a clear patch of the floor. He turned to the other three. "Clean that shit up and wake him up again." Migo shoved Bo. Bo shoved Brett. Brett went to get a mop. 15 minutes and several packs of smelling salts later, Ben was somewhat awake again. "You know," Ben groaned when he came to, "if you keep doing that, I'm gonna end up concussed. Do I look concussed? I feel concussed." "Stop saying concussed!" Alan felt a throbbing in his temple. He closed his eyes and took a slow breath. "Listen, asshole, I'm gonna make this real simple for you." "Oh, that'd be great," Ben said woosily. "'Cause I don't think I'm in the right headspace for anything complicated just now." "Shut the..." This time Alan had to keep his eyes closed for a 10 count before he could stifle the urge to knock him out again. Fortunately, it always took him a while to count all the way to 10. When he felt a bit better, he opened his eyes and nodded to Bo and Brett. They hauled on the chains looped around Ben's wrist, finally getting a satisfying, if momentary, scream of pain from Ben. Feeling more confident, Alan stepped closer. "Something went down in that vineyard where you live in that shit shack that ended up with my little brother dead, and I think you know about it." His head was thrown back hard against the post, and his teeth were gritted against the pain, but Ben managed to nod and groan. "Yeah." Bo and Brett let off on the chains, and Ben slumped forward, breathing heavily. "Well?" Alan asked. Ben spat blood on the floor from where he had apparently bitten his own tongue. "I know a lot of things," he said quietly. "I have friends that have a lot of connections in this town, and people talk." With a show of effort, he lifted his head and looked Alan in the eye. "Especially about the richest family in the valley, with 3 sons, a father that doesn't give a shit about them, and only one of them smart enough to inherit. And it sure as hell isn't the middle one, or," he said with a bloody grin, "the dead one." Alan was red with rage. He could hear the blood roaring in his ears. If he didn't know any better, he'd swear the little guy was trying to make him kill him. But even though he really, really wanted to, he hadn't gotten anything from him yet, so he'd have to be smart about this. But because there was something about the fucking grin on his face that really pissed him off, he decided he would just beat on him until he said something. He nodded to Bo and Brett, who pulled the chains tight again, and for a solid 5 minutes, Alan drove his fists into Ben's stomach, ribs, and shoulders, then finishing up by driving a heel into his knee. He wished he had thought to tie him up with his legs apart so he could kick him in the nuts, too. He stepped back, breathing heavily. Pulling a kerchief from his pocket, he wiped the blood from his knuckles where he had caught the chain a few times. In his fury, he hadn't even noticed. Bo and Brett let off the chains again. Ben's head was drooped down, and his breathing was heavy and raspy. Out of the corner of his eye, Alan noticed Migo was frowning thoughtfully and looking around the shop. He ignored this and said once again to his prisoner, "Who got my little brother, asshole?" "It was..." Ben gasped. "Spit it out!" Alan roared. "It was a demon." "A fucking what?" Ben took a deep breath and rested his head back against the post. "It was a demon with lipstick and a pink tutu. Pulled his nuts out through his throat. I saw the whole thing. It was really fucked up." Alan's shoulders slumped and he pinched the bridge of his nose. All he was getting from this was a fucking headache. "Fuck it. Do your thing, Migo." Migo's grin stretched even wider than it had been before. He reached behind him and pulled a wicked-looking knife. Stepping up nose to nose with a ragged, chained-up guy, he began to mutter softly to him. Alan knew that tone. It meant they would be dragging out a cut-up body later. "I'm gonna cut you up good, Guero," Migo was saying. "I know how to cut a guy so he don't bleed much, but little parts of you will be hanging out all over the place. It might take you days to death." There was a sound, like two coconuts smashing together, and Migo dropped like a sack of wrenches. Bo and Brett, who'd been standing by holding the chains, were suddenly hauled off their feet, dangling in the air. That's when he heard it. The sound that Migo had been looking around for. A high-pitched, vibrating sound that was now reverberating in the roof and walls of the shop. Without knowing how, he was able to identify it. It was the sound of chains under such high tension they were twanging. He looked up and saw dust falling from the rafters. When he looked back down, Ben was looking right at him, grinning. Only it wasn't the same grin. It seemed sharper somehow. And if he was honest, he didn't think it was Ben either. When he spoke, it definitely wasn't Ben's voice. "You want to know who killed your dipshit little brother?" His eyes had gone yellowish, and they were glowing. Holy shit, he had glowing yellow eyes. The grin got wider, impossibly wide. Inhuman. "I did." With a series of incongruently muted pings, the weak links in the chains gave way and fell from Ben's body, which didn't seem so puny anymore. Then, the screaming started. In hindsight, it probably wasn't a really good idea to have padlocked all the doors. So it seems as though the devil on Ben's shoulder has gotten him out of another bad situation. But what are the ramifications? It does seem as though his smart-ass side has come out a lot, but that could be because of his brother coming back into the picture. But the blackout, or the changeover, didn't seem to be quite so abrupt this time, did it? What do you suppose that means? But as always, if you like this story, make sure you slap upon the like and subscribe button. And hopefully, we'll see you in the next one. Until then, take care, be good, and bear up.